Bill Jenkins won the 1972 NHRA Winternationals in a Chevrolet Vega. That sentence needs a moment. The Chevrolet Vega was a subcompact economy car that Consumer Reports described as having the worst reliability record of any American car. It was built on a platform that GM had rushed to market to compete with Japanese imports, fitted with an aluminum engine block that had a documented tendency to warp, and sold to the American public as evidence that Detroit could build a small car if it really tried. The general consensus was that Detroit could not. What Bill Jenkins did to this car, and what the NHRA did to Bill Jenkins in response, is the story of what happens when an institution builds its identity around a particular engine, a particular power structure, a particular way that racing is supposed to work, and then one man with a welding torch and a calculator walks in and takes it apart. Jenkins's nickname was Grumpy. He acquired it because of his expression in the winner's circle, uniformly dissatisfied, as though the elapsed time he had just run was an insult to what was theoretically possible. He was not celebrating. He was calculating what came next. The nickname stuck. The dissatisfaction was permanent, and in the early 1970s, it was fully justified. To understand what Jenkins did, you need to understand what NHRA Pro Stock was in 1970 and 1971. Pro Stock was the professional class of production-based drag racing. Cars that looked, in theory, like something a civilian could buy, but were in practice purpose-built racing machines with production bodywork as a legal requirement. It was the class where you needed to recognize the car even if the engine had nothing to do with its showroom origins. In 1970 and 1971, Pro Stock was the 426 Hemi's domain. Plymouth and Dodge ran the class with Hemi-powered Barracudas, Darts, and Dusters that had been developed specifically for Pro Stock competition. The Hemi's hemispherical combustion chambers, its oversized valves, its ability to flow air at high RPM, all of it translated directly into Pro Stock performance in a way that wedge-head small block engines simply could not match. The Chrysler contingent was winning. The Chrysler contingent expected to keep winning. The Hemi was the engine you ran if you were serious about Pro Stock. Jenkins had been serious about drag racing since the 1950s. He had built his reputation as a small block Chevrolet tuner, not because the small block was the best Pro Stock engine, but because Jenkins understood it at a depth that most people who ran the same engine did not. He understood its breathing characteristics at every RPM point across its operating range. He understood its friction losses, its thermal behavior under sustained load, its response to compression ratio changes. He had spent years extracting power from an engine that most of the competition had correctly identified as inferior to the Hemi and moved on from. By 1971, Jenkins was running a Camaro in Pro Stock and consistently competitive with the Hemi cars, which was itself considered remarkable. Then Jenkins looked at the rulebook. NHRA Pro Stock rules used a weight brake system, a minimum weight requirement that varied based on engine displacement. The logic was straightforward. A bigger, more powerful engine should carry more weight, equalizing competition across different configurations. The weight brakes were built around the assumption that large displacement big block engines would run in the bodies that match them. Hemis in Barracudas and Darts, big block Chevys in Camaros and Chevelle. The system was calibrated for that world. Jenkins noticed something. The Vega was a legal Pro Stock body. It was also significantly smaller and lighter than a Camaro or a Barracuda. Under the existing weight brake rules, a small block engine in a Vega body would be required to carry less weight than a Hemi in a Barracuda, because the weight brakes were indexed to engine displacement, not to what the total package could achieve. The rules had been written for the cars that existed. The Vega was a car that existed, but that nobody had thought to race. Jenkins built a Vega. The Vega's body gave him advantages that the rulebook had not accounted for. It was lighter. Its shorter wheelbase changed the weight transfer dynamics at launch. Its smaller frontal area reduced aerodynamic drag through the traps. Combined with Jenkins's small block tuning expertise, the cam profiles, the cylinder headwork, the carburetor calibration that he had spent years developing, the Vega package produced a car that ran times the weight brake system had not been designed to permit. At the 1972 NHRA Winternationals, Jenkins's Vega ran a 9.07 at 148 miles per hour. That was a pro-stock elapsed time record. It was also, in the language of racing bureaucracy, a problem. Jenkins did not win by cheating. He won by reading the rulebook the way Smokey Yunick read the rulebook, by understanding what it said rather than what it intended. The rules permitted the Vega. The rules permitted his engine. The weight brakes as written gave the Vega an advantage that the rule makers had not intended to give it. Jenkins had found the door. He had walked through it twice. NHRA's response was what the institutional response always is when one competitor finds a gap that the rules didn't intend to leave. They closed the gap. Specifically, they revised the weight brake rules to require the Vega to carry significantly more weight, a change that was openly acknowledged to be a response to Jenkins's dominance. The revised rules were written in terms of body class and wheelbase rather than engine displacement alone, which had the practical effect of eliminating the advantage Jenkins had built his entire program around. Jenkins did not take this quietly. He told anyone who would listen that the rules had been changed specifically to stop him, that the change favored the Chrysler contingent, and that the institutional relationship between NHRA and the Hemi manufacturers was not a coincidence. He was, in the blunt arithmetic of what actually happened, correct on all three counts. The rules had been changed. The change did favor the Chrysler teams. Jenkins was the specific target. What made his complaint more than sour grapes was the pattern. This was not the first time a successful competitor had found a legitimate advantage in the pro-stock rules and had the rules revised against them specifically. Don Nicholson had done it before Jenkins. Dick Landy had pushed the limits in different ways. The NHRA pro-stock rulebook in the early 1970s was a living document that reacted to success rather than preventing it, which meant that the most important skill in pro stock was not just being fast, but being fast in a way that the institution could not easily regulate away. Jenkins continued racing. He won the pro stock championship in 1972, despite the revised weight brakes, because his engineering capability was not entirely captured in the weight advantage the Vega had provided. He won again in subsequent years with different cars, continuing to extract performance from small block Chevrolet engines that the Chrysler contingent and the rulebook writers had consistently underestimated. The longer view of what Jenkins accomplished in pro stock is this. He forced the rulebook to treat all competitor cars as potential performance threats rather than assuming that only certain configurations were worth regulating. Before the Vega, the weight brake system had been built around the engines that were actually racing. After the Vega, NHRA had to consider what might race. That is a more sophisticated set of rules, and it exists because Jenkins built a car that the previous rules had not anticipated. He also permanently changed how pro-stock tuners thought about the relationship between body selection and engine package. The idea that a smaller, lighter body was a performance variable worth optimizing, not just a cosmetic choice or a marketing requirement, became part of the pro-stock calculation specifically because Jenkins had demonstrated it with a 9.07 elapsed time in a car that Consumer Reports had recommended against purchasing. Bill Jenkins died in 2012. His obituaries described him as one of the greatest engine builders in drag racing history, a key figure in the development of pro stock as a professional class, and a man whose mechanical thinking influenced an entire generation of racing engineers. They were all accurate. What they didn't say, because obituaries tend toward diplomacy, is that the institution that eventually honored him had spent a significant portion of the 1970s trying to regulate him into irrelevance, and that his response to every rule change written against him had been to go back to the shop, find the next gap, and build the next car. He was grumpy because he was always running slower than he thought he should be. He was never slow enough for the rule book to stop worrying about him.